Welcome to the Likeville podcast. This is John Faithful Hamer. Before we get into our podcast, I just wanted to remind you to please like us on iTunes, leave comments. These are good things. Share the podcast with your friends, even your enemies. And if you would like to support us, please do so at our Patreon account. So today we're going to be talking with Andrew Miller. Andrew Miller is somebody I've known for a long time, and I'm fascinated by his trajectory, his career trajectory. It reminds me very much of Frederick Law Olmsted, who's the man who pretty much designed landscape architecture, and he is the one who designed Mount Royal Park here in Montreal and Central Park in New York City and all these other things. He began as a historian and a journalist who went through a number of different careers and ended up sort of planning city parks and things like that. So Andrew has had a similar trajectory, but we'll get into that. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so maybe if you could just talk a little bit, obviously we have some very big issues we want to talk about in terms of the future of cities, but the trajectory, the windy road that got you to where you are now. I mean, it's how'd you get there?
So I had thought as a teenager that what I really wanted to be was a professor. So that's the arc that I followed, and I think it's a very traditional arc. I did my undergraduate degree, excelled and at McGill, and I used that to get me to Yale for graduate study, which in turn I used to get into a doctoral program at Johns Hopkins, and so far, so standard. In graduate school, I began to have my doubts about the way that we do higher education in certainly North America, and for all I know, the West today, which we can get into later if you like. But I had my doubts whether this was something that I wanted to do, but because I wanted to stick with it, because there was social pressure, because I had my own expectations, even as my doubts continued to mount, I finished my degree. I began teaching sessionally. As we say in Canada, it's adjunct work, as they say in the United States. I was
slave labor,
making stabs at building a publication record. But there came a day I was teaching at the University of Guelph, which was about a 45-minute drive up the road. And I was preparing to go and teach my class, but the mail had arrived for that day. So I picked up the mail and was leafing through it. And there was a circular from the city of Mississauga, which is ironic, given that is where I work now. It was a circular from the city of Mississauga that was talking about a transit project that was then underway. And I read it with absorption, thinking about how this project was going to affect the city and its pros and cons. And I read it and I thought to myself, and I still remember this, it's very vivid in my mind. I thought to myself, if in my next life, this is what I want to spend my time doing, is thinking about how cities work and trying to make them work better. And like a bolt from the blue, the revelation came, you schmuck, you only get one life. This is it. If that is what you want to do, then you should do it. So, life is not a movie. I'd already begun to look for other opportunities outside of higher education. But yeah, if life was a movie, that would be the moment, because it certainly did crystallize my sense that what I should be doing is working on issues that mattered to me. And it took several more years. I went to work for the Ontario government, and I was working on a file that I wasn't at all interested in. I was in my follow-up interview. I had an interview. I did well. I came in and was interviewed for a follow-up interview. And my boss said, okay, so when I hire you and you come on board, what do you really want to work on? And I said, I want to work on public transit policy. And he said, great. And the next week I came into the office and he said, okay, you're working on hospitals. So I did healthcare infrastructure for about a year, which is good because I was totally incompetent. I didn't know what I was doing. It took a year to figure out how government worked and how to do things. So after a year, I'd earned my spurs and was moved on to the file. And this is another story that I like to tell. So for all you kids listening at home, I want you to know that I attribute my success heretofore to luck. Sure, I like to think I'm a smart guy. And sure, I like to think that I'm a hard worker, but I've also been exceedingly lucky. That's given me the career that I have. So what happened is I got onto the file of public transit in June of 2007. And I was brought onto the file not because they thought they really needed someone to do public transit, but because there was too much work to do on highways. So my good friend Alan, who I just saw this week, we caught up after a few years of absence. It was good to see him again. But he was going to be the senior man on the transportation infrastructure file, and I was going to be the junior man. And he was going to do the important stuff, which was highways. I was going to take the small stuff, which was transit, off of his plate so that he could devote himself as the senior guy to where the effort mattered. So I arrived on the file. This was in June of 2007, if my memory is correct. So I arrived in the morning. Sometime after lunch, it was announced that the government of Ontario was about to invest billions of dollars in public transit projects. And this had all been cooked up between the Premier's office and a private consulting firm. So no one at the Ministries of Transportation or Finance nor Infrastructure knew anything about this. So all of a sudden, there was demand for briefings on public transit across government. And I was the guy on the file. So
this sounds exactly like a Malcolm Gladwell story, like where he talks about... I think it's in Outliers where he says that this lawyer who ended up becoming heading one of the biggest law firms in the United States was a Jewish lawyer at a time when the white shoe firms didn't hire Jews, and he did the kinds of law that nobody else wanted to do, but it just turned out that the kind of law he was doing ended up being incredibly lucrative and going large, right? So you had the kind of the less prestigious sort of position on this, and it ended up being very important. So
very important. And again, it's not all luck. Hard work helped because I'd been interested in it. So even though I'd been working on hospitals during the day, I was still reading, back in 2007, blogs were still where it was at in terms of intellectual content on the internet. So I was reading all the transit blogs and I was up on the issues. So the fact that people needed briefings right away, I was equipped to do them because I had the background knowledge I'd picked up.
Well, I just got to stop you. If you're going to do a public service amount, then I would like to sort of, before you go on with this story, you could just sort of tell the kids about the perils of praise. I mean, it's a piece you wrote a couple of years ago, which I think is absolutely amazing advice. And it's specifically good advice for sort of people like you, people who always did well in school, got straight A's. Can you just sort of talk about that a little bit?
So, yeah, it speaks very much to my experience in that first year of fumbling incompetence that I alluded to a moment ago, which was that first year as a civil servant was really the first time in my life that I'd ever experienced being bad at my job. Because up to that point, my job had been being a student, which had come easily to me my whole life. So when I was at Yale, I was unhappy, but that wasn't because I couldn't do the work. I got very good grades. So I was unhappy there, but it wasn't because I was bad at my job. I was good at it. I'd never not been good at my work until my early 30s when I came on board. And all of a sudden, I didn't know how to do what I was supposed to do. I didn't know who the people were. I didn't know who the people that were the right people, what they needed. I didn't know how to give them what they needed when they told me what it was that they needed. I knew nothing. It didn't help that I didn't get very good training or orientation, but a lot of it was on me. And I found myself very unhappy. And the reason that I was unhappy was because I was used to everyone being very grateful to me for all my wonderful work. And now I wasn't getting that anymore. And even when I was doing work that, I don't know how good it was in retrospect, but at the time, work that I thought was actually up to a very good standard, the response I got was nothing. The expectation was you do good work and that passes without comment. Bad work gets condemnation. Good work is expected. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't doing good work very often, and certainly in the early days, hardly at all. I do remember, again, with quite vivid clarity, the one day I came back to the office having gone to a meeting with some people at Cancer Care Ontario where I'd actually done my job well. And I said, wow, I feel competent again. It's been so long. But I didn't think about it at the time, but I thought about it in years later, which prompted me to write that essay, which was that I was, in a sense, I'd become dependent on, if not addicted to, praise, and I was going through withdrawal from it. And that withdrawal manifested itself in a variety of ways. I was seething with resentment about my colleagues and especially my bosses. The Dilbert sorts of fantasies that they're just they expect the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they don't know how hard it is. Above all, I had power fantasies, revenge fantasies, where I would be suddenly noticed by someone in a position of authority who would recognize my wonderful talent and would pluck me up out of obscurity. So it's I'm sure you can find all sorts of examples of this in popular culture because it's a very popular fantasy. The one that I used in that essay was the movie Big, where the Josh Baskin character, that happens to him. He's toiling away in obscurity and not being very good, but the owner suddenly notices him and makes him a VP and gives him power, and above all gives him money and autonomy, and turns around and the company reaps huge benefits from this. That's what I wanted. I wanted someone to recognize how great I was. And if there's a problem with that essay, is it doesn't end with a pithy summation of what you should do about it, because it's just like going cold turkey. I'm not sure there is anything you can do about it. You have to work in an environment long enough to get over the sense that you are entitled to a gold star on every piece of work. Eventually, you gain the pleasure of recognizing your own mastery increasing without having to get the external validation that it is increasing.
Yeah, I've seen, since you wrote the essay, the Perils of Praise, I've noticed that what you describe in that essay applies. I mean, it definitely applies to sort of what David Brooks calls lifelong valedictorians, people who've been getting gold stars their whole lives, been doing really, really well at all that stuff. It definitely applies to those people. But I've also noticed that it applies to a lot of artists, a lot of musicians, a lot of writers. They also have that same sort of, almost like a Cinderella or a Snow White, sort of like someday my prince will come, and they're just like waiting to be discovered. And that's just not the way the world works anymore. It's just, you're not, generally speaking, what happens now for musicians, for writers, for all the artists, you go out and create your audience, on like Instagram or, whatever, Snapchat or whatever. You go out and create your audience. And then afterwards, the company comes and says, can we work with you after you've already done that, right? And even then, people end up still sort of, making their own career, their own, right? So we are kind of going back to a very entrepreneurial sort of way of going in the world. People are reinventing themselves all the time, the way you have, right? So anyway,
I've been told, this is not something I can speak to with any authority, not being a woman, but I understand Sheryl Sandberg talks about this in her book, Lean In. She describes it as the tiara effect, where women particularly are socialized to be excellent, but not promote their work in any way. Wait for some external force to validate them. I think she uses the metaphor of someone placing a tiara on your head, like you're Miss America. And that is pernicious because it means that you are waiting and waiting for external validation. You're not willing to even recognize your own mastery, much less try and cultivate an appreciation of it in others. This is, I'll return to the story in a moment, but I'll say that in terms of, I volunteer my time as a career coach to academics who want to leave academia and become civil servants, much as I did.
I totally forgot about that. The way you described it to me the first time, it almost sounded like people that are coming out of a cult and they need to be sort of deprogrammed, and you put a bag over their head and take them to some place in the woods.
Well, it's not just Johns Hopkins. I have friends that went to the Kennedy School particularly at American schools, there is certainly, no one ever comes out and says this explicitly, but there is, they all come away clearly with the idea that we have indeed plucked you from obscurity and brought you here to the summit of Mount Olympus because you are the young Turk that's going to revitalize the field. We are giving you the resources so you can do that. In return, remember, noblesse oblige. You must devote your life to repaying this investment we have made in you by carrying our reputation forward, by doing great work. And that anyone who does not do that it's not just that you are going to be forgotten and that your work is meaningless. It's that you've also betrayed us in some sense. You have failed to return the investment that we are making in you. And that is a very powerful psychic burden. I know I bore it. My departure from academia was more painful than it should have been because I had this unspoken, no one ever told me this, I just picked it up somewhere, this unspoken burden. And
well, it's also because you were like the top of our class, you were like the golden boy. I mean, you were like with your honors paper. If I remember, your first year paper was like with great distinction or something like that.
It won the award for best paper.
Won the award. You were like the golden boy. So yeah, I mean, I remember talking to, I think it was Carl about this, and Carl said, I think what a lot of us were thinking, he said, it's so unfair. Like, I can't believe Andrew hasn't been able to like find something good. Like, it's just, and he was just really kind of shaking his head. Like, this makes no sense at all. Right. And my response to him, because we both ended up in the same program, but I came from a very different route than you. I never did well in school until really much later on. I failed grades. I got kicked out of schools. I didn't do well in school. So I understood that the game was not fair and was rigged in certain ways. And so when he said that, my response was like, it's not fair, Carl. Like, the game is not fair. I agree with you that this is sort of unjust and everything, but this game is rigged, and it's been rigged for a while. There's not enough jobs for the amount of PhDs they're producing. It's a game. It's a musical chairs game that it's very cynical. I said, in medicine or law, when there's a glut of lawyers on the market or a glut of doctors on the market, they go to the schools and say, don't put out very many lawyers and doctors for the next couple of years. They control sort of supply to some extent at the other end. Whereas when it comes to something like the humanities and PhDs, they have such a vested interest in having a lot of us around as a cheap labor source, for TAs, for research assistants, for various reasons. They have some perverse incentives for just letting in way more people in the full knowledge that they're not going to be able to get those jobs at the other end, right?
Well, I never got a tenure track job, and the easy thing to say would be to refer to what I said before, is that hard work and ability isn't enough. You also need to be lucky, and I was unlucky. But that's letting myself off the hook. We'll never know if I would have gotten a tenure track job, but certainly one reason I didn't is I wasn't putting the work to buff up my publication record. And the reason I wasn't doing that was because I knew, even though I wasn't prepared to admit it to myself, that I didn't want an academic job. And so I couldn't bring myself to do the work for something, a lot of work for something I knew I didn't really want. So had I done the work, would I have gotten a job? We can't run that experiment again. All I can say is that, this is, hindsight's always 20/20. It seems to me that the life I've had up to this point has been a wonderful life, a great career that I do not regret at all. And I don't think that's sour grapes. I think that I have to interrogate my own conscience. I think I actually am happy. But,
well, compared to the people I know who went into academia, you're much happier. So I think it's because the kind of work that you're doing is very, very kind of intellectually interesting and exciting and challenging. Whereas very often, as you know, for most people who get into, especially if you get in a very specialized position, it gets quite boring, and you're kind of doing the same thing, and you're in a rut, and you're supposed to read a lot and keep on one little kind of subject, and it's not very conducive to having a kind of creative intellectual life, right?
Well, I suppose we should talk about city buildings. So let me return to where we started. I can finish the story and then we'll get into it. So in 2007, the government of Ontario announced this huge transit expansion. All of a sudden, transit was the file that everyone had wanted briefings on. And I was the guy that they were looking to. And so I was giving briefings. And what this meant was, well, I would say that in Southern Ontario, from that day up into the very present, and with no signs of stopping, public transit has been, if not the number one, the never less the number 3 issue of salience in every election campaign, municipal, provincial, and in some cases, even federal. This is something that all of a sudden everyone cares about. And in government, there's all sorts of work to do, but only work that matters to the people at the center, the people at the very summit of the pyramid, that's where action happens. That's where things move fast. On files where there isn't that attention, things move slowly, if at all. So I was being highly visible. My stuff was making a difference. And I made a point of, speaking of the Sheryl Sandberg and leaning in, I was making a point of, in ways small, but I hope subtle, making sure that people understood that I deserved credit for the things that I was doing. That sounds, and I'm sure some of people in our audience, when they hear me say this, are recoiling at the audacity of this opportunism. But another one of my maxims is that it is not enough to do good work. If one wants a successful career, one has to be seen to be doing good work.
Oh, that's interesting. So this is a change in mind, because I remember early on when you were into this career path, you said to me once, and it wasn't your coinage. You said it was attributed to some, I don't know, senator in Texas or something. And you said you can go a long way in government if you're willing to let other people take credit for your work.
Oh, yeah. That was the name alludes to.
So you changed your mind
former
about
governor
that.
About Texas. Well, there are 2 levels here. It has to do with our Westminster system. Is you always let elected officials take credit for your work, and you always let your bosses take credit for your work, but you don't let them take sole credit. What matters is that the people in the system where you want to improve, they understand how the game is played. It's like when the assistant deputy minister says, we've done this great file, everyone knows that it wasn't him, it was his whole team, but he's the one whose name gets attached to it. But you are probably not competing for his job. You're competing for a manager's job or a team lead's job or a director's job. So when you're talking to people who are hiring for those jobs, you say, I did this work. And so the credit, you never dispute when your bosses take credit for their work, but you and your boss, you're not in competition with your boss. You make sure that the people who are positioned to hire you for your next job, that they know what you have done. Okay. And for my audience, I would want them to understand that it is not dishonorable to seek credit for your own work. It is not dishonorable when you've done something great to be willing to sign your name to it. Because if you don't, if you just assume that you can do it anonymously and people will do the work to figure out who did this, they won't do that. So
that's but I mean, there's been some pretty big plagiarism scandals when you have people who come out of government, and then especially I know from the American example, like who come out of government, having been there for decades, and they go into, like, let's say academia, working in some, and they just continue the same practices that they were doing in government. So they'll hire a bunch of people to like work on a project and get them to write up bits of it, and then they'll publish it as their own.
Oh yeah.
And get this actually happened to me once when I was living in Baltimore, like when I remember with Annalise's old boss, right? Where this guy just, right? He asked me to go and look into a particular issue and to write a report on it. I wrote the report on it, and then I was surprised to see it in a magazine the next month published under his name.
Yeah.
Right. And he just saw this, as completely okay, because he had been for decades in government in DC, and, you take credit for other people's work, right? And I told him, like, this is not okay, right? But apparently this guy would go to meetings sometimes, and he was the guy who wrote this famous report. And, various, like the equivalent of like the Moynihan report, right? Mm-hmm. And people would ask him about this famous report, and he would look puzzled. Like he was like they say about Al Gore's book on the, on the environment, like even he hasn't read it. Like it was like, so you're saying you have to make sure to actually get credit for the work that you're doing.
Yeah. And so I did. And consequently, as we say on our resumes, I held positions of my positions were progressively more responsible. And so I moved from infrastructure to finance to transportation, and from thence to the city where I now work, where what I'm doing is delivering a master plan for rapid transit. So I'm doing transit policy, which I know pretty well, but it's also about land use and how to develop land use and densify cities in such a way that the land use is what we call transit supportive development, as opposed to, I suppose, transit antagonistic development. The idea that land uses and transportation have to reinforce one another, and if you do it right, they can. So you create a synergy. So that's what I'm doing now, and it is my dream job. I've never been happier to be doing this work, and it's very, very shortly going to reach a culmination. And so I don't know what is going to happen next. What does a man do when he's done his dream job? I guess he has to dream a new dream. I'm not sure what that'll be yet. But I started in transit. It sounds horribly, horribly pretentious, but there is, I see what I do now is city building. There's really no non-pretentious way of describing that, because urban design is actually a specific discipline, and urban planning is a specific discipline. I don't do those things, but I try to think at a macro level about how to make cities work better through transit, through land use, through a variety of things. So that is what to circle way back to the opening. That's the question that you asked. Is I went from being a professor, or a would-be professor of 18th century Aboriginal history, to being a professional city builder. It's been quite a ride.
That's wild. So this is the thing, right? City planning and urban planning has a really bad rap because, they point to a lot of these planned cities have been disasters. They're not livable, right? And this is sort of a general pattern. You have architects build these buildings that are very pleasing to other architects, but nobody likes to live in them. They're incredibly uncomfortable spaces to be in, right? And you have this is one of the problems of specialization, that you have artists who are making art for other artists. You have movie makers making, pretentious movies for other pretentious movie makers, and so on and so forth. So so when you're trying to sort of city build, as you put it, do you try and sort of look at what's already happening and help that along, or are you trying to sort of build it and they will come, right?
I should preface all this by saying I am not a professional planner. So everything I've learned about this, I've learned on the job. So I'm sure there's wide areas of theory that I'm ignorant of. And so for anyone who is offended at my appalling naivete, I will apologize in advance. But it seems to me that there are two ways of going about it. And it depends on whether you live in Europe or whether you live in North America. So in some parts of the world, Europe, but also places like New York, the city is already built, and it's been built in a particular way, and it's giving you particular outcomes. So if you don't like those outcomes, you need to change them, and that's really hard work. So you have to sit and think about where it is that you want to be and how to get there. And you may not be able to get there. You can only get part of the way there. You have to think about, you cannot just raise a whole city block. Well, you could a few decades ago, but I think that era has closed. You can't raise a city block and start again. It's very, very hard to do that. Whereas in North America, for many of our cities, including the city where I work, until recently, you were still building things. You could start from first principles. Now, the irony is that starting from first principles didn't mean that we actually got the cities that we wanted, because you were starting from nothing. The path of least resistance was just to let the developers build the city the way that you wanted it to be built. So city planning was relatively, you could come up with plans, but there was a lot of pushback if you were asking for more than what developers wanted to give you. Now that the green space in my city is all gone, and we are now moving into the second half. We have to think about how to get to the city that we want, and we have to think about how to operate within the constraints that are available. So my project was about taking an area that was built up, but we still thought we could change, that had high potential, and so we are changing it. So
how so?
So, start with the premise that, and you can dispute this premise, but I think among professionals it is not one that people dispute. Start with the premise that growth is good, that a city where population is increasing is what we want. And the reason why population increasing is a good thing is because elected officials like it. It shows that they are dynamic. It's a metric that can show that they're doing something right. As more people come in, that broadens the tax base, and so it's possible to then maintain city services or even expand city services without increasing taxes. So growth is an engine that makes everybody happy. But growth has consequences. And the chief consequence that we see in our cities today is congestion on the roads. More people means more cars, which means it's harder and harder to get anywhere. This is problematic in a few ways. One, residents don't like it. They don't like having to be stuck in traffic everywhere. If there's one complaint I've heard from citizens, it's they don't like traffic and what are we doing about it? But it also, in the long view, that will crush growth. At some point, you will look at a city and say, I don't want to live there because my commute to work will take far too long. I don't want to establish a business there. I won't be able to recruit people to come in because it's an undesirable place to live. I'll find another urban center where there's less congestion, where home prices aren't as bad. Look at how Amazon is trying to find a second headquarters, and whether or not Toronto is actually a viable candidate for that, we can talk about that if you like. But everyone who looks at it says the Achilles heel of our bid, the obvious Achilles heel is that housing prices in the GTA are far too high. It would be very hard for all the workers that Amazon wants to bring in to find places to live. So growth leads to increased congestion, and it can lead to a housing market that prices people out. So you need to fix this problem. How do you do that? The way that you do that is through densification and intensification. You have to take areas of the city where you're not housing as many people as you could, build in all the empty spaces, and build up. But the joke that they say in American politics is that Social Security is the third rail. Touch it and you die. In municipal politics, the third rail is settled or established communities. Touch them and you die. No residential community wants to see change. And if you threaten to change, they will go to their elected officials who face elections, and they will then exert their influence to keep it from happening. Not in every case, but in general, that's the principle, is that the people that are motivated, the people that are most motivated to engage with politicians are people who live in established residential communities. This has been observed, is that future residents don't have a vote yet. So there's no constituency that's responsive to their needs. The only constituency that is responsive is our city councilors or the mayor, and they answer to existing residents. So it's the concerns of existing residents that get primacy. Typically, existing residents likes things as they are. They don't want to see more growth because that will dilute the value of their homes. In North America, we regard our homes as our principal investment vehicle. So people have a very strong financial interest to not allow anything that could dilute the value of their homes, which means they don't want to see change in neighborhoods that could do that. So you can't densify without alienating those folks. So what we are doing is we found a corridor that is, because of the historical peculiarities of development in my city, is largely free of settled residential communities. So there is scope for density there. It also happens to be a corridor where there's lots of opportunity. There's already a lot of transit growth, but it can accommodate even more. So it is the perfect place to put more residential development and more transit. And so we are putting them both in at the same time, or that is the plan.
But another thing, on a similar topic, but we've had a problem here in Montreal, and I know this has happened in many other cities in Canada and the United States and all over the place. Because of climate change, we are getting weather events that used to be once a century are happening once a decade. Weather events that used to be once a decade are happening, once every year, once every 2 years. So, and one of this is we're getting floods.
Oh, yes.
Right? Well, we had these big floods here last spring, and a lot of homes were destroyed. And part of the looking into what happened, we actually discovered that historically there have been big floods in Montreal. You can look back that they've happened, and after they happened, and this is a pattern that's reproduced itself all over the place, they would pass laws that would say you are not allowed to build on this land because this is a floodplain that is going to sort of flood every maybe once a decade, once every 2 decades. You're going to have a really difficult spring, and this is going to flood. But what happened later on is because there was very rapid growth after World War II in Montreal, there were developers that saw an opportunity to make a lot of money and to build on this land. And so they went, and through various ways, sometimes through outright bribing, sometimes through various methods, they got these municipal councillors to give them exceptions and let them build on this land. And so they built whole settlements and houses on this land. And then those have maybe they notified the original people who bought the places, maybe they didn't, whatever. But then these houses have now been sold, bought, many, many times. The people who own it now are, for instance, one of my former students, her place, like her family's home, was completely flooded. And they've been in Canada for 6 years. They're fairly recent immigrants to Canada. They had no idea that they were buying a house that was on a floodplain whatsoever. And now when you try and go to the insurance company, well, of course, the insurance company finds the document, way back that says this was built on a floodplain. They say, well, we're not going to cover you, right? They're not going to cover this. And then they go back and they want the government to bail them all out, right? Which, of course, the government usually does. But I'm wondering, do you face similar issues, right, in what you've done so far, where you have developers wanting to build on places where they have no business building? And
yes, absolutely.
So how do you deal with that?
So let me answer that. There's a broader point that I want to make, which is the hot issue in urban planning right now, it seems to me, is discussion about how in California there is not nearly enough housing being built to satisfy the immense numbers of people that want to live in California, especially in Northern California and the Silicon Valley area. It's the same dynamic I described before. Every person that moves in means that the value of a homeowner's house goes up by some huge proportion. And the faster it goes up, the more determined they are to prevent this cash cow. If you had an ATM in your house that was spitting out $100 bills every day, you would do your damnedest to prevent it from being shut off or removed. So homeowners in California do just this. They squelch through their control of local councils any attempt to densify and intensify. This is something that we don't face in Ontario because the province steps in, and a lot of powers that are reserved for the municipality in the United States, in Ontario, as you and I have had occasion to complain about before, municipalities are regarded as creatures of the province. There are many powers that are reserved for cities elsewhere that in Ontario are reserved for the province. And there's a lot that you could complain about here. But there's some areas where it has done positive good. So, for instance, we have a growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe where the province of Ontario says, okay, cities in the Golden Horseshoe, you must accommodate the following amount of population growth. And so you must show us an official plan that demonstrates you're going to produce that amount of new residential housing within a certain time frame.
Wow.
And if you don't do that, there are consequences. And similarly, when it comes to flooding, Ontario, like so many areas, I want to say North America, but it's in the world, where were towns founded? They were founded along waterways because until quite recently in human history, waterways were how you got around.
The highways.
Yeah, it was, you couldn't travel by road, but you could travel by boat. So the thing about developing a city around a waterways, as you have said, waterways flood, and now more than ever, thanks to climate change. So we have a situation in Ontario where so many of our towns and cities have development that, were we starting from scratch in an enlightened regime, we would never permit that development, but it's here. So what do we do about it? So the province of Ontario's response is to designate areas that fall within dangerous floodplains as areas whereby you cannot grow anymore. The existing level of density is permitted, but you cannot increase that level of density. And the province will backstop in the case of emergency flooding. It'll backstop that existing growth, but because they're on the hook for it, you can't do any more of it. So there are developers that will come in and say, you have to let me put in more, you have to let me put condos on my land because I'll be able to make quite a bit of money from it. And even if I wanted to, I can't. Even if I were bribed, I can't. It's not a power that I have. It's been removed to the province. And the province, it's much harder for any individual property owner to influence a provincial level official than it is for a city level official. The thing about, we often, for all that we talk about corruption, the phenomenon of corruption in Canada, at least, I'm not well versed enough to speak around the world, but in Canada, it pains me to say it as a municipal civil servant, but the closer you are to your elected officials, the more corruption happens. The farther away from them you are. So famously, as a Quebecer, I don't need to tell you this. It's the mayors who are corrupt.
Yeah, we've had mayors in the city that were taken out in like handcuffs recently.
Yeah.
So
you've had mayors in this, elected municipal officials in the city who couldn't, when the sting came, they couldn't close the safe because it was so stuffed with cash. They couldn't close it before the investigators swooped in.
Yeah.
But it's less common at the provincial level, and even not non-existent, but even less so at the federal level. The farther the order of government is from you, the harder it is to have undue influence upon it. So moving this to the provincial level means that when we see landowners that really want to see intensification in flood zones, we have to say it's not up to us. What we can do is the incentives work right, which is that we would like to allow this development. We can only do that if we reduce the flood risk. So we have to find a way to reduce. If we can do that, then we can lobby the province. And the province has an incentive to get rid of those prohibitions on development because, remember, they're backstopping. They don't want to see floods there any more than we do, but they're also not going to. They're not going to remove it unless it can be demonstrated that there's a good reason. So, yeah, flooding is an issue, and I think the solution to it is much like the solution to housing is that it pains me to say it, but it is proper that some decisions get removed from the municipal level and moved to the provincial level so that you can get people that are distant enough from the problem, they can act in the public interest rather than being swayed by parochial
How
interests.
anti-democratic of you.
I know.
Technocratic solutions, right? So,
Well, and especially given you and I, we have a history of arguing that municipal governments deserve more autonomy, and in many places they do. But it can't become a slogan. There are some things that really municipalities should not be trusted to do. So you want to have it is going all the way back to Aristotle. Designing a good government is hard work, and you need to look at a lot of examples from a lot of jurisdictions to figure out what works best. Unfortunately, once you know what works best, these structures are very resistant to change. So,
well, I just think not so much to Aristotle, but to Jane Jacobs, right? And Jane Jacobs, her critique of urban planning and of this whole thing is she said very often they have I'm sort of paraphrasing her message here, but they have a kind of field of dreams approach. Build it and they will come, right? And very often you build it and they don't come, right? And it's and so her idea is that it's much better to look. She has this wonderful example where she says, if you have a big lawn in front of a school or a university or rather than putting the pathway where you think it looks pretty or where you think it would be best, instead go and look at which parts of the grass are worn down because people always seem to walk on that route. And what you might find is that they walk diagonally from, this corner to this corner. And you can tell because it's all kind of muddy and the grass is dead there. And she said, put your path there. Yeah. Put your path, follow people's existing flight paths and how people are, and reinforce and work with as a carpenter would say, go with the grain, right? Like rather than trying to have this platonic, godlike, we shall design the republic, the Sidian speech, right? We'll design this perfect thing that nobody wants to actually live in.
The planner's term of art for what you just described, the worn paths in a park that show where people want to go, it's beautiful, which is why I remember it. The term is lines of desire.
Oh, that is nice. Yeah.
So there's one. I think it was a Scandinavian planner who said, when
it
you
sounds
build,
like a very Mike Davis City of Quartz type line.
It's from some Scandinavian who said that you build a park, you just lay down grass, come back in a year, see where the lines of desire are, pave there. That's the right way to do it. In a similar fashion, I will be coy and not name names so I don't embarrass anyone. But in Southern Ontario, and I'm sure for our listeners, you can just plug in the name of your jurisdiction. You can think of transit projects. So transit service, higher order transit service that was created not because there was demand to travel from point A to point B in that place, but because land was cheap. And so, the government is building it. We're going to keep our costs low. So we'll build it where we can put it most affordably. And then it sits largely unused because no one wanted to go there. The hope is that once it is established, people will use it. And in fact, that's not the case. So,
but how do you even know how people are going to be using transit in the future? Like, let's say you figure out what the lines of desire are. Like, for instance, in Montreal, the biggest problem we have right now in terms of our transportation infrastructure is it was all built on the idea that the number one daily commute was going to be people living in the suburbs and coming in from the suburbs to the city to work during the day, and then at the end of the day, driving back to the suburbs. So the system largely is like a wheel, like a bicycle wheel, where it spokes off from the middle. However, what's happened is that all these companies and organizations have actually built their plants in the suburbs because land is much cheaper and because they find it easier to deal with the municipal governments of these smaller places and, whatever. So the most common daily commute in the Montreal area now is people going from suburb to suburb.
Yes.
And doing that is hell, because the system, very often what that means is you need to drive almost all the way downtown and then take a highway to go back out to your suburb, because there's no, like, as the crow flies, there's no easy way to go from here to here, even though it's actually quite close geographically speaking. So, and the problem there, I don't think, even if the people, when they were building this system, it's not like they did a bad job, right? If they were actually building a system that made sense based on what was happening at the time. So how do you, when you're building something that's supposed to be useful for like half a century or more, how do you know what people are going to be doing in the future?
Well, before I answer that, I'll say that the situation described in Montreal is much the same in Toronto, where we have a wonderful system for getting people down to Yonge and Front, to the central business district, and that was effective. That's allowed the business district to grow to such a huge extent, because we didn't need to be bringing in people from with the highways. They could come in by GO Transit, the regional rail system. But now we have the big problem of, in the old area code system, down Toronto proper was 416, and all of the different suburbs, the whole ring around was the 905. It's intra 905 travel is the big problem now. And you're right, our system is not set up to accommodate it. In fact, my city, which is a suburb of Toronto, is now a net importer of jobs. More people come into the city to work than leave to go to other cities. Even
That's
Toronto.
Amazing. And this was basically built as a bedroom community.
It was. Yeah. So the answer to your question is, how do you anticipate? Is that it's very hard. And it seems to me, and I'm not I'm not I'm not in any position of authority, but so my answer to this question, when anyone bothers to ask, is that we shouldn't try to anticipate. We should be lagging, not leading, because it's very hard. It's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. If I was in charge of, I'll just say Toronto. If I was in charge of Toronto, rather than trying to pick the right alignment for a downtown relief line where the subway should go, I would put express buses along all the major corridors. And I would keep track of what the ridership is. And where ridership got above a certain red line, I would say, okay, now we're going to take a lane on that street. We're going to dedicate it exclusively to buses. And then I would sit back and wait. And I would see where ridership on those express lines was rising. And when it crossed another red line, to say, okay, now I'm going to put a light rail transit line in there. Or if it's really high, so now I'm going to put a subway in there. You can't. Now you see the problem with this approach. The immediate objection to this is, by the time you know where the demand is, it's really bloody expensive to build there. It's much cheaper to try and gamble. Build it ahead of time where you think the demand is going to be, and then when the demand appears, it'll the fact that you've built this line will just encourage more development. That's the way that we've been going, but it's led to white elephants. I think that the way that we have to do it is we have to try to, rather than try to gamble, we should accept we're going to have to pay higher costs, but put the service where people want to use it. And so, among your listeners are people saying, "Well, thank God he's not in charge." I'm sure that, but I think that prediction, you can try, but it leads to white elephants. And
the other thing that I've seen that is another thing that you can't really predict, which is, I guess, the opposite of a white elephant, whatever that is give you an example. Right here in Montreal, we extended the metro line north to Laval, right? Had a couple stations in Laval, and everybody thought this is absolutely, and this was promised for a very, very long time. They finally did it. They got the metro line to Laval, which is the second largest city in Quebec. And immediately what happened was so many new people started using the transit system every single day. way more than they ever imagined. People bought up more land. The land values went really high around those metro stations. And so what happened is there were so many people using the metro that it was, I mean, I would very often, when I was getting on Sherbrooke Station to try and, to go to work, a couple of metros would pass where people were so packed on the metro, nobody could get on. So I would sometimes wait for, 3 metros would pass where I could not get on, right? And so sometimes the opposite can happen, that you build something and so many people start using it that it actually floods the system, right? So, I mean, it took them a while to adjust to that. But now the way they've done it is they basically have almost back-to-back, at rush hour, it's almost back-to-back subways. Like it's unbelievable. They, one leaves and practically another one shows up immediately, and that's how they did it. I mean, have you seen anything like that in the Toronto area where you build something and it's overused, right? You build something to try and alleviate stress on the system, and instead it actually brings way more users into the system.
The GO regional transit system, the regional rail system, it had a problem like that right up until the 2007 financial crisis, where it was overloaded. And then the financial crisis, there was enough an economic downturn that the pressure was taken off. It's climbing up again. It's currently the case that the city of Toronto wants to extend its Yonge subway north into the northern 905, but it just shouldn't be done because there's too much usage along the Yonge line. That the central station, the Yonge Bloor station, which it cannot accommodate more people safely. At peak periods, it's unsafe, the number of people that are on the platforms. So now that wasn't as a result of them building it and it being unexpectedly useful. It was a question of growth over time. But it's a nice problem to have when you get there, and the solution to that is to then you start thinking about how to build. You can't put in any more trains. The issue is the station, not the frequency of trains. That's why we call it a downtown relief line. It's to relieve the Yonge line north of Bloor because it's just too crowded. So I think the answer to there is, as you look where these people are coming from, lots of people are coming from points east and point west to get the subway because they want to go south. So give them another south running line to the east or to the west, and then that will relieve the pressure, the relief line. And now that we have data we have a fare card in the GTA called the Presto card. So it gives people data about where people are boarding, where people are getting off. And so you can see that they get on a train here, go get on the subway there, go to a subway, then get off and go somewhere. You can see, so really what they want is to go from point A to point B, but they're going point A to C to D to B. So then you can build another line that goes from A to B. We have the data now in a way that we didn't generations ago to do it. The problem, again, is that building from A to B is going to be expensive, but that's the name of this game. This is a thing that really bugs me about it's an American discourse that I think infects us in Canada, which is to imagine that your transportation network is or should be a profit center, that if you are doing it right, then the system should be generating a profit on every rider. That is not realistic. There's very few systems in the world that the transit jargon is fare box recovery. This is where you get enough money from the fare box to cover your operating costs. Hong Kong does it. Singapore does it. I think in some contexts, New York is able to do it. They're the only ones in the world where you have enough density to make that work. Everywhere else, transit runs at a less than 100% fare box recovery. And what that means is that every rider costs the system money. So you create really perverse incentives where a transit system might not want to grow. It doesn't want to provide more rides because that'll just dig it deeper into the hole that it's in.
I didn't realize this. Yeah.
So it creates all sorts of problems because people want this, politicians want the system to grow, but they also don't want to fund it even to support the riders that it already has. We have a situation in Ontario where it's, relatively speaking, easy to get capital funding for your subway. It's easy to build new infrastructure, somewhat less easy to get money to maintain it, but to actually run it on a day-to-day basis, to pay the operators, you don't have money for that. So it leads to very perverse outcomes. So
yeah, we had somebody on the podcast who was talking about how this affects sort of railways, right? And how they say they're trying to get more and more people to move more freight by rail because, it's better for the environment and things like this, rather than having it on 18-wheelers, on trucks, right? And they say, because, for various reasons this is good, but they said it's really hard because our competition is massively subsidized by taxpayers. So 18-wheeler trucks put a huge amount of strain on our highway system. They age our system. That's one of the main reasons why we have to have it repaired so often, is because of these big heavy trucks that go back and forth. But when the roads break, it's the taxpayers that fix it. When the railroad tracks break, it's the railroad company that has to fix it, right? So they say, we have to actually keep up our infrastructure, whereas the trucking industry gets their infrastructure covered by taxpayers, right? Which makes it harder for us to be competitive, So I guess I didn't think about that. That would be the same with transportation, that it's running at a deficit, and so sometimes they don't want to increase ridership. That's weird.
So a friend of mine came up with a scheme, and I always thought it was brilliant. It's one of those wonderful ideas that will never be implemented. But if you actually wanted the magic of the marketplace to work in transit, what you would need to do is the relevant government would have to say, okay, we are going to provide a subsidy. So for every passenger per kilometer that you move, we will pay you a fixed rate. Let's say maybe it's 8 cents, maybe it's 20 cents, but whatever it is, move someone from point A to point B. For every kilometer they travel, you get this much subsidy. And that is universal. We'll give that to the regional transit system. We'll give it to the subway. We'll give it to taxi cabs. We'll give it to Uber. Anybody that moves from point A to point B, prove that you've done it, and we'll pay you this subsidy. And what's more, we are going to keep this in place. We're going to bind ourselves that this will be in place for 40 years, something like that. Then every transit system, they know what their margin is on which they can make a profit. All of a sudden, the marketplace works. They've got an incentive to borrow money to build lines that will enable them to move people, because they'll be able to recoup their investment, the debt, service the debt, and still make a profit. Then you will see people building lines where there is demand, and you'll see people gambling to build lines where they think it's going to be. And some of those gambles will pay off and some won't. And the ones that won't, they'll. But that is, in a capitalist system, that is how you would make transit work, is you would need a massive public subsidy to make it work. We don't do that. So consequently, you get horrible situations where politicians choose lines based on what will get them votes. There was a scandal about this in Ontario recently where certain transit improvements were being proposed by the relevant government. There was no business case for them, but the people in charge of the decision knew they could get votes for it, and so we're going to make it happen irrespective. So you get, and the worst thing is those new stations that were going to be open was going to worsen traffic on the line for everybody. The trains would have to stop, so everyone would be that much later for the trip would take that much longer, for the benefit of very, very few people that were getting on. So we were going to spend a lot of money to make everyone's experience worse. But we were doing it because this is one of the other perverse incentives that we have, is that transit isn't seen as just a utility like part of the water system or the electrical system. It's seen as a status symbol, where my neighborhood deserves transit and it's got to be overbuilt. So I've heard time and again, there's one complaint I heard about the project that I'm building, which is going to be bus rapid transit. We're going to put in a lane for bus traffic. Is it, well, why aren't you building a subway? Subways are better. And I would smile and say, well, they are better, but they cost 10 times as much.
At least, right?
And the ridership won't be there, so it'll lose money on. Well, I mean, every transit trip loses money, but this will lose money hand over fist. We couldn't do anything else because we'd be spending all our money servicing this unnecessary overbuilt system. And the response would be, well, I don't care how much it costs. It's the best, and that's what we deserve. We don't say this about, I want the water pipes that are coming to my house. They've got to be made
gold plated.
They got to be made of space age polymers. Yeah. No PVC or copper for me. I want the stuff that they built the space shuttle out of. We don't see the water system or the electrical system as a status symbol, but we do for transit. So again, in Toronto, it seems to me that the whole controversy over the Scarborough subway extension, it's being driven by a status competition, that a subway is the best system. And if you don't support a subway for this constituency, it means that you hate them because you're...
Well, I'll tell you, here in Montreal, we have a very long winter, and we have a couple months where the snow is very, very intense. And you really can see how wonderful it is to have a subway when you've just got a massive, massive snowstorm that's happened, and still the city can function. And I can tell you, the part of my daily commute that is on a bus is drastically slowed down when there's a big snowstorm, right? Drastically. Even if they have, been doing their best to clear the streets as quickly as possible, that leg of my trip can be as much as 3-4 times as long as normal. Whereas the subway part, it's exactly the same in July as it is in January, as it is in February. It's always exactly the same thing because it's underground. It's like, and so in a really cold climate, the subway does really feel like the best. I know it's extremely expensive, but it feels worth it in January.
So we can interrogate that some. What is it that people like about a subway? You like the fact that it gets you from point A to point B in a reliable way, whereas during a snowstorm, your bus doesn't. So what you want is not necessarily a subway. What you want is a reliable, predictable trip. You want to know that when you get to the station, whatever it is, that you will get from station A to station B in this amount of time, and that you won't have to wait for a vehicle. It'll arrive when it says it's going to arrive, or it'll arrive within 2 minutes, and that the trip won't be delayed unexpectedly. The question is, can we deliver reliable, predictable service without having to dig a very expensive tunnel underground? I would suggest that we can. Pardon me. So in a Montreal context, I would imagine that what that is that you have to have a dedicated lane for your bus or your transit vehicle, and you have to have snowplow equipment or enough snowplow equipment that you can keep those tracks clear, and that would run. Would that be expensive? Yes, it would. Is tunneling a subway expensive? Yes, it is. You can run the numbers. In fact, that's what you do when you're doing transit services. You can run the numbers and come up with a sense about what is most valuable. So what will deliver the service and how much it'll cost and what the right investment is. All of this can be quantified. That's what transit planning is to work out how to give what levels of service you can get and how much you're willing to pay for it. But again, that should be done on those grounds. What level of service do we want? How much will it cost to provide that level of service? And then you make your decision based on that. You don't make the decision based on those guys over there have this kind of service, and so I want it too.
Well, you mentioned before the density of the cities, right? And a lot of people have pointed out that the way many North American cities, especially the newer ones, things like Phoenix, right? And the way that they are set up is based on cheap fossil fuels and on the automobile, right? So you could be really spread out because people have cars, because gas is really cheap, right? So, I mean, regardless of how you get to this, whether it be trying to reduce fossil fuel consumption to combat climate change, or whether you buy into the peak oil thing, whatever. You can come at it from different directions. But to what extent, when you're planning out something like this, do you take into account the possibility that we might suddenly have, that gas might be much, much more expensive for either because it becomes more expensive to extract, or because we've put so many carbon taxes on it that it's much more. And then suddenly all sorts of people that live far away from city centers, far away from work, are going to have to somehow get to work by public transit because they won't be able to afford driving there. I mean, does that go into any of your sort of calculations?
In the narrow sense, the narrowest sense, it does. So the transit operators in my city buy futures contracts for gasoline so that they are insulated against the possible spikes in the price of diesel fuel. So that's
How did I not know that?
That's just part of the game when you're running a transit system, is you have to remove that risk. In the larger sense, though, you're asking, how do you handle, is exogenous the word I want, but unexpected shocks that could disrupt all of your planning. So the example that I'll give you is autonomous vehicles. Everyone's talking about autonomous vehicles. Everyone's convinced they're going to arrive. No one's convinced when they're going to arrive or what it's going to happen to our transportation networks when they do. Will it be partial adoption? Will it be full adoption? What effects will that have on how people get around? Some people think that there'll be fewer cars on the road because we'll all just be hiring autonomous vehicles to drive us around. So other people think, well, if it's that much more convenient to get around, there'll be a glut of autonomous vehicles, so the roads will be even more congested as they are. We'll have more sprawl if people are freed from the burdensome task of driving themselves, if they've got a robot chauffeur to do it for them. So the answer is nobody knows what autonomous vehicles are going to do, and nobody knows when they're going to arrive. But when you're in the business of planning something out through 2041, so a 25-year horizon. So I'll be honest with you, we didn't plan. We know that it's there, but we can't figure out how to model that intelligently. So until we can, we're going with business as usual. So it could very well be that we won't need public transit in 30 years because everyone will have robot cars that are taking them from point to point, and you don't need. I don't think that that's likely myself. I think there'll still be efficiencies in using these systems. Like that's how we feel about climate change right now. Is that with nuclear power plants, we would rather not build more of them because they're very expensive. They're prone to cost overruns. They, at least as currently constructed, they pose a great deal of risk. But they're already built and they're providing carbon-free power. Yeah. So we should run them to the end of their useful lives rather than getting rid of them. We won't build more, but we should continue to use the ones that we have. That is my attitude. I can't speak for the profession as a whole. In fact, God forbid that I do that. but I think we should just continue to plan as we have. These systems will continue to provide legacy value even if autonomous cars come in. The same way that we still have printed books, even though in so many ways electronic books are superior, but the two systems can live side by side. Radio continues to exist even though we still have podcasts.
Yeah. Well, it's another thing I wanted to ask you about is right now we have this debate happening in this neighborhood, particularly Plateau Montréal, but it's happening in many other places over the issue of parking, right? So we just recently elected our new mayor, Valérie Plante of Projet Montréal, and their attitude, especially in this neighborhood, is that they are not trying to accommodate cars. So they're actually shutting down streets, right? And they're changing the sort of the direction of traffic on streets to sort of calm speeds. They're not doing much to kind of increase the amount of parking spots, right? Now, this has made a lot of store owners really, really angry, and they say this is terrible for our business, and you're making it so hard for people to come here and shop, and they can't find parking and all this stuff. And Purujimayal's answer is, well, you know what? You're being too short-sighted about this. We're actually trying to make this into a very livable neighborhood where people can walk and live. And we're making it the kind of place where many people with money are going to want to move here and live here. And wouldn't you like to have a whole bunch of people close by who have money that can walk to your store? And in terms of the long-term viability of your business, this is way better than thinking that all your business is going to drive in, right? Because ultimately, people who are big drivers, they can go out to the suburbs and get whatever you're selling, cheaper at a big box place, right? So I'm wondering, do you deal with similar sort of fights between the car people and the non-car people?
Well, there's one happening in Toronto right now where one of the busiest transit lines in the city is the King streetcar, because it brings in all sorts of people, especially from the West. And the streetcars they run back to back. They're always full. So streetcar after streetcar will go by you and you can't get on because there's no room. And it would help if they could move faster, but they're streetcars. They're not in their own lane. They're stuck behind cars. So one car that's making a left-hand turn can hold up 3 or 4 streetcars.
Wow.
So the city of Toronto did something that they're doing a pilot whereby they didn't go as far as I would have liked them to go. They didn't say we're just going to shut Kings down to cars during peak periods. And so if you want to bring in stuff by truck, you can do it at 11 o'clock at night, but otherwise no cars. But they did the next best thing, which is they followed the more European pattern where there's no through traffic on King. If you turn left onto King, you can go on King for 1 block, but you must leave King by a left or right turn at the next block. So only local traffic for that block is permitted. There's no through traffic. This has meant that the streetcars move much better. Again, it's like I said before, streetcar travel is now more reliable and predictable. But the business owners, the restaurant owners on King Street have screamed bloody blue murder at this. It's destroying our business. One went so far as to create a giant ice sculpture of a hand flipping the bird to all the streetcars that run by, which I thought was a remarkable exercise. And maybe flipping your customers the bird isn't a very good way to bring in business.
Is this a Doug Ford voter, would you think?
I have no political opinions. I am just a civil servant. But so this is something that's happening right now. So whether you're talking about Toronto or in Montreal, the thing to understand is that local business owners, they don't think in the long term. They can't afford to think in the long term. They have to think every month, am I going to be able to make my rent this month? Mm-hmm. Anything that disrupts business in the short term can be lethal to them. So they have to think very hard. They have to resist very hard against any change because their business model depends on there not being any changes. And the fact that, look at St. Clair. This is an example that you might not be familiar with, but the city of Toronto built a dedicated lane only for streetcars, so turning streetcars into something like rail transit along the St. Clair Avenue. And it was not managed well, and it took much longer than they thought it was going to take, and all the business owners complained that you're going to kill us. Well, guess what? Business is better along St. Clair than it ever was. Now there's so much more foot traffic, taking away spaces from cars and allowing people to just hop on and off the subway easily. Business is booming along St. Clair, except it's not booming for the people that were there before construction. They all went out of business. The new people are doing great, but the old ones aren't. So they were right to complain about that project because, in fact, it did kill their businesses, many of them. So the policy response here, and the city of Toronto is exploring this, is to, rather than make existing business owners bear the cost of a benefit that's going to be felt by the entire city, is to offset some of their losses. So giving them some sort of this, you can give them a break on property taxes, you can subsidize them directly. There are tools you can use, but some way to make sure that they can stay afloat during a period of construction so that they don't have to unfairly subsidize the benefits of everyone to come in the future. But no, you don't allow the present to have a veto on the future. That's what has happened it's happening right now with land use in Silicon Valley. That's, that way lies madness. So the thing to do is empathize with business owners who complain, but find a way to get them through the difficult times, and they will benefit just as much as everyone else does from these changes. As far as parking goes, one of the things that cities do, I'm certainly, for my project, we're going to be looking into it, is once you have rapid transit in an area, what you can do is future development, you relax your parking minimums. You assume that some member of the people that live along the corridor are going to use public transit, so you don't need to devote as much space to parking. It's already happening in Toronto. I was talking just last week with a colleague of mine in the city of Toronto who was saying that so many of despite the fact that surface parking lots are now as rare as hen's teeth in Toronto because they've all been turned into condominiums, there's so many buildings that have got parking garages that sit mostly empty. And they are so now they're investigating all sorts of alternative uses you can do with parking garages, turn them into more storage, hydroponics, because the demand for parking is not what it was, because increasingly people, as I found out when I was driving down to Montreal for this weekend, driving in the downtown core is so nightmarish that you take transit if at all possible. You don't own a car, so you don't need as much permanent storage for cars. Perhaps we've reached peak car. So
I don't know about that, but my cousin works for Transportation Canada, and one of the things he's been mentioning to me is that increasingly in new plans they need to incorporate disaster planning and incorporating things for terrorism, for big energy crises and things like that. So at the municipal level, do you have to do that as well? Do you have to take those things into account, or?
It's happening. So my municipality is developing a climate change plan. It's not quite ready for prime time yet, but it's in development. And I was speaking a few weeks ago to one of the architects of it, and I asked him, so what are we doing here? Are we trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, so to prevent climate change, or are we trying to mitigate the effects of inevitable climate change on our infrastructure? He said, both. We're going to do both. So even as we try to find ways to make the city more green and reduce our emissions, we're also thinking hard about our building codes and to make sure that those storms, those floods, those things that are going to come as part of climate change, that we are ready to build, we're ready for them. So it's an underappreciated fact that the stereotype, and again, it's something that every jurisdiction has it, but in Canada, we import a lot of this from our American cousins, that government is full of stupid time servers who are corrupt at worst, but lazy gold bricks at best. And then this takes us back around, I suppose, to the beginning. So maybe it's a good place to end. But one of the things that held me back from leaving academia and going into public service was my fear that I was going to be giving up the life of the mind, that I would no longer be surrounded by intelligent people. And what I have found is that, it's so far from the case that so my colleagues, many of them, they've got degrees from what, we would snootily say are second or third tier Canadian universities, yet they are very bright, they're very dedicated, they're very good problem solvers. It's true, the erudition isn't the same as it was in university. You can't drop, the name of, no one's heard of Adorno. And people haven't even heard of Nietzsche in many cases. But so they many people lack that surface polish. But are they bright? Are they dedicated to the public good? Are they creative problem solvers? Are they willing to think about out of the box problems and come up with unorthodox solutions? in every case, yes. I think we Canadians we don't know how good we have it, and that we've got a strong tradition of public service, and that public servants take their job seriously and do it well. It's like anything else. If your body is healthy, you don't notice it. It just seems to you to be normal. Our body politic is we don't know how healthy we are in terms of our public administration. So I feel this sounds cheesy, but I assure you it's true. I think that we are very blessed in this country by the quality of our governance, and it's something that we take for granted.
Yeah. I would just like to close by saying I think, if you are a doctor, if you're a surgeon, and somebody asks you, why do you do what you do, right? And they give you these very idealistic answers. They say, well, if I can save some guy's life and add 10 years to his life, that's 10 more years that he can be with his loved ones, that he can be with his grandkids and his wife and stuff like that, his kids. I'm quite idealistic about transportation for similar reasons. I think if you can find a way to reduce somebody's daily commute by a half an hour, right? That's a half an hour more that they get to spend with their kids, with their friends, with their spouse, with their, that's a half an hour more life. And if you add that all up, right, over a year and over a decade, 2 decades, you're in the same way that like a surgeon who saves a life is like giving them a whole bunch of life back. If you can find ways to move people more efficiently and more safely so that they can get to their destination faster, you're giving them all this extra life, right? And I think that's a really beautiful thing. But anyway, thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and I will have to do this again. Thank you, Andrew.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
So once again, if you would like to support the Likeville podcast, please like us on iTunes and leave comments and share the podcast with your friends and enemies. And if you'd like to support us financially, you can do so at our Patreon account. Thank you. Bye for now.